When analyzed through Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, Atwood's Alias Grace illustrates that the subaltern is not only voiceless, but also is completely deficient of an authentic self and story. They are silenced through the mediatory discourse of her story, romanticization of the subaltern, and Spivak's principle of strategic essentialism.
Atwood was born in Ottawa in 1939. Atwood gained her status by writing extremely descriptive pieces of feminist literature with themes of women in a patriarchal society. Published in September of 1996, Alias Grace is based on real-life events, much inspired by the writings of Susanna Moodie at the time. Atwood also wrote a play and a series of poems on the subject, titled The Servant Girl and The Journals of Susanna Moodie, respectively.
The story opens with Grace Marks, a poor Irish immigrant turned talented seamstress, working in Mrs. Palmer's house by day and spending her nights in the penitentiary. She is held there for the murders of Thomas Kinnear, who was her previous employer, and Nancy Montgomery. Mrs. Palmer, as well as Reverend Behringer, believe that Grace is innocent and hire Dr. Simon Jordan to file a report after a series of interviews with Grace. While she tells her story, Dr. Jordan begins to fall in love with her and remains unsure of her innocence. When all else fails, Dr. Jordan brings in a hypnotist to help him decide. The hypnotist is a friend from Grace's past. The spirit of Mary Whitney possesses Grace and confesses, which is why Grace cannot remember the murders. Dr. Jordan realizes he cannot publish his findings because he will be perceived as a quack in the medical community, but he also cannot leave without filing a report. He evades this debacle by escaping to the USA. He completely forgets his time in Canada with Grace due to a head injury. Grace eventually gets a pardon in 1872, without her story ever being told.
One never encounters the voice consciousness of a woman's testimony. Spivak pens this quote in her Can the Subaltern Speak in regards to that in telling the subaltern's story, regardless of their gender, the full and complete meaning of the statement will be lost. This occurs from being lost in translation, whether literal or due to a concept or practice that does not exist in the non-subaltern's realm. It can also be due to a more complex factor of a hidden agenda, such as a political slant that William Sleeman discusses in his Rambles and Recollections of an Indian Official. In Atwood's Alias Grace, the full story of Grace Marks is never brought to light. Grace recalls her time with Mr. Kenneth Mackenzie, her lawyer, and says, "He wanted me to tell my story in what he called a coherent way, but would often accuse me of wandering and become annoyed with me. And at last he said that the right thing was, not to tell the story as I truly remembered it, which no one could be expected to make any sense of, but to tell a story that would hang together and that had some chance of being believed." So not only is Mr. Mackenzie removing her voice consciousness, but he is going even further to advise her to change her story entirely. His character is only worsened as the book progresses, as it is revealed that the many misinformations that Miss Susanna Moodie provides in her account of Grace after visiting her were falsified by his complete detachment and removal of her voice consciousness and true story. Dr. Simon is later left questioning the truthfulness of Moodie's accounts due to Mackenzie, as he says, "What other parts of Moodie's narrative were due to Mackenzie's own flamboyant tastes as a raconteur?" Dr. Jordan is the other key player in the translation of Grace's story, for although he thinks he is doing good, Laura Mulvey writes in her preamble to Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, Spivak worries that even the most benevolent effort merely repeats the very silencing it aims to combat. After all, colonialists often thought of themselves as well-intentioned. Dr. Jordan is the colonizer in this situation, for he shows serious interest in Grace and is serious about figuring out the roots of her mental illness. But at the end of the day, he has the goal of opening a self-benefiting asylum, where he can gather patients and ideas about them, like a collector, as Grace internally describes him in Chapter 5. He doesn't even do her the justice of finishing her story, as he abandons his work after Grace's hypnotization revealed unconventional results. Prior to his departure, he also tries to direct her story to fit his agenda, enforcing his own tactics instead of letting Grace tell her story as she remembers it. His methods fail him, for while certain tactics may prove more successful through clinical studies, each mind is different. With Grace being the subaltern, it is only fitting that her story is not told in a way that is hers. Spivak argues that the romanticization of the subaltern further essentializes those oppressed, and in doing so, they do not provide discourse different from the colonizers. The views of other intellectuals, such as Guha, counter the views of Spivak in that they romanticize the subaltern. The statement that the subaltern continued to operate vigorously in spite of colonialism adjusting itself to the conditions prevailing under the Raj is disputed by Spivak by arguing that this merely repeats the damage caused by the initial colonization and gives value to the people only when they include the practices of the colonizer in their ways. In Alias Grace, Dr. Jordan begins to fall for Grace when she fills the need of his report.
Grace's lawyer attributes her performance-like storytelling to the fact that perhaps Grace Marks has merely been telling me what she needs to tell in order to accomplish the desired end, which is, asks Simon, to keep the Sultan amused. Grace is aware that Dr. Jordan admires her and plays this to her advantage, maintaining her role as subaltern, for it is easier to maintain her innocence under ambiguity, blurring the lines between truth and falsehood that Dr. Jordan is determined to define. Grace is aware that Dr. Jordan does not have the goal of proving her innocent, but to simply reveal her repressed memories and use his results for personal gain, neither of which give her a voice or the opportunity to share her story in a way that is her own. Spivak theorizes a concept of strategic essentialism, which is different than traditional essentialism. Essentialism is the concept that an entity or group has a set attribute that allows them to be defined as such. In the mid-19th century, women were viewed as either innocent and incapable or deceitful and evil. This was the core part of being a woman, maintaining your innocence. Grace keeps a demure stature throughout her childhood and working life, as did Mary Whitney. Mary Whitney used the perception that she is innocent to become deceitful. She lived outside of the traditional view of a woman. This, in essence, is strategic essentialism. Spivak took the concept of essentialism. Instead of dismissing it as impossible for a subaltern to experience, she states that it is important to make some essentialist claims, even while one retained an awareness that at best, those claims were generalizations. Mary Whitney, as told by Grace Marks, is the opposite force of what a woman should be, which is what Grace shows Dr. Jordan and the public. As a subaltern, Grace can only be granted permission to speak because she strategically makes essentialist claims to the idealistic womanhood. Dr. Jordan hears her claims because she is an innocent woman. Whereas contrasted, if Mary Whitney had possessed Grace's body throughout the novel, she would be seen as deceitful and never allowed to tell her story. The only way a subaltern can tell her story is if she disintegrates part of herself to partake in the societal norms that allow her part of the woman group. Spivak describes the subaltern as a deviation from an ideal. Grace has separated herself enough from innocence through the murders, but maintains the certain amount of innocence to be considered a subaltern. Paradoxically, this creates a hybridity in Grace. She maintains a certain amount of innocence for survival. Marx tells Dr. Jordan what he wants to hear, not the whole truth. She maintains her innocence, but has the evil woman of Mary Whitney in her body. Mary Whitney is the true subaltern, the complete deviation from the norm. This does not deny Grace's subaltern designation, but her identity is not the sole cause of its difference, as said by Spivak. Mary Whitney is only brought out through the intermediary voice of Dr. Jordan, but her voice is never heard beyond that. Spivak states, for the true subaltern group, there is no unrepresentable subaltern subject that can know and speak itself. The intellectual solution is not to abstain from representation. Although Mary Whitney is real, she cannot speak. Her voice is heard, yet she is never there. Her otherness, the outside of the norm, is hidden by Grace's hybridity and strategic essentialism, to the point that Grace is not even aware of the true subaltern presence. Grace does not have a true story because she is neither essential nor a true subaltern. She cannot have a true story without having an authentic, identifiable self. She strategizes her innocence just enough to please Dr. Jordan, which furthers her own side.
The story of the subaltern is an essential piece of the patchwork quilt that is a truth. If the subaltern can never speak, part of the whole truth is lost and can never be found. If the subaltern patch is missing, you cannot have a whole quilt. A single truth is presented through the colonialist perspective. Forcing people to tell their truths in a colonialist way is simply removing the subaltern's truth. Therefore, the subaltern cannot speak, even through a seemingly enabling discourse.
The most impressive element of Alias Grace was Atwood's ability to maintain the ambiguity of the truth. Atwood creates this ambiguity to put Grace's truth into the reader's hands, which further distorts the story of the subaltern, rendering her silence beyond the reader's point of view. The reader's perspective is essentially Grace's truth. Atwood effectively combined historical facts with fiction, but the inclusion of historical articles and documents in the novel took away from the post-colonial slant that she adds to her fictional writing.